you have to go into the debate room now. You've been having like a long, philosophical disagreement with your debate partner about where Yemen and Oman are, respectively. Right. So this is pretty much the same map. It's missing some of the East Asian countries. Okay. Who thinks they got most of them right? Who thinks they got most of them wrong? Nobody willing to admit that they might have got most of them wrong? Who thinks they got Yemen and Oman mixed up? Who thinks they labeled something in the Gulf incorrectly because they thought the Bahrain was like a lot bigger than it was? Okay, cool. So first, I'm going to show a lot of maps today, because the first things first, if you're doing international relations debates about any region, you have to be a little bit of a cynic, and some facts do become very important in the debate. For instance, where countries are, what countries they border, and what countries they don't border. Okay, so this is a label of all the countries. My next question is if you can circle any major hot conflicts. So conflicts where there's ongoing violence. I'll give you like 30 seconds for this one. You don't have a lot of prep time. So current hot conflict areas. Just ongoing violence. Okay, time's up. Last quiz question. Circle the name of one country that is a Sunni majority country, and circle the name of one country that is a Shia majority country. If you don't know what those words mean, we'll explain as we go. Okay, that shouldn't have taken too long, so there's not a lot of options. Okay, so first question. Can somebody tell me one of the hot conflicts they circled? So somebody raise your hand and tell me. You back?
Saudi Arabia and Yemen.
Okay, so Saudi Arabia and Yemen on the peninsula. Where else? Any other suggestions? Someone else's hand? You're all debaters, you're going to speak in public all the time. Like, I'm going to start calling on people.
Somewhere south of Sudan.
Okay, then a little bit further afield. Well done.
Israel and Palestine.
Israel, Palestine. Any other conflicts that we saw circled?
Syria.
Okay, good. Syria, so like the whole country of Syria, just one big circle. Any others?
There's all the bits of Iraq, where everything comes
Okay, so like where we would think Kurdistan is, where would we think that is?
The other side.
Okay, so the northern Iran, Turkey, and northern west corner of Iran. Good. So where Kurdistan would be if Kurdistan is real. Any other circles?
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, yeah, current hot conflict. Okay, one last one.
Iraq and Syria against IS.
Okay, so probably something we would still characterize as a hot conflict for the people who are living there, but not necessarily one that's going to be a big topic in international relations debates anymore, because we don't have a lot of boots on the ground as Westerners. Okay, so give me one of the countries you circled as a Sunni majority country. Clara? Saudi Arabia. And what country did we circle as a Shia majority country? Really? Okay, so I had a lot of mumblings of people hearing other people say Iran, so kind of mumble the sound of Iran and hope they don't get called on. Good. So there's only one Shia majority country in the world. That's Iran. There's a whole bunch of Sunni majority countries in the world, but the classic one that most people will know is Saudi Arabia. Okay, so I'm going to talk for 15 minutes.
Bahrain?
Well, pretty much every country, not Iran, is a Sunni majority country.
Bahrain, I think.
It is.
Demographically.
Also confusing.
Ruled by the Sunnis, but majority Shia, I think.
Yeah. Or Lebanon, some people pretend it is, some people pretend it isn't. Yemen is an ongoing philosophical disagreement as to whether it is or not. The one country that you can happily, easily identify, as you can see. Okay, so for the rest of this, I'm going to talk for 15 minutes. I'm going to try and talk through the region. I'm going to show a lot of maps, because I find maps the easiest way to consume information about countries. If you want to start, or you feel you don't know enough about the Middle East, or you want to get a really good grounding as a good place to start and have topics to think about, Vox has an article called 50 Maps to Explain the Middle East. Go read that and look at the maps, and save the maps and put them in your Matter file, and update the maps when the maps become out of date, because those are going to be most useful for being able to consume information quickly. Some of the maps that I'm going to use are from that article, and so if you've read that article, you're going to find them familiar. But the reason I wanted you to fill in the map to start with is to give you an idea of where countries are, but also because geography is still relevant when we talk about international relations. Where countries are, what resources they have, and what their neighbors are like is a relevant question in international relations. We often think in a globalized world with lots of internet connection, we don't need to think about the fact that at the beginning of the Syrian war, Syria was experiencing a severe drought that pushed people out of the countryside and into cities. The question of geography is still a really relevant one for understanding international relations, and one that becomes incredibly relevant when understanding the Middle East. So, there's a couple different ways to understand the Middle East, or ways that people will tell you that they understand the Middle East. If you are doing anything except being a potentially expert lecture from a Middle East expert that has many PhDs, unless you're at that and someone tells you that they know the Middle East or perfectly understand it or really know what they're talking about, they are definitely selling you something or lying. Because this is a region that moves incredibly quickly, there's a lot happening on the ground, and there's a lot of contradictory information about what the interests of different actors are. So I'm going to talk about a number of different ways to split those interests. I'm going to talk about economic development, I'm going to talk about conflict, and I'm going to talk about religion, and split it down those ways. Let's start with religion, because it's the one that most people understand. So most people will think of the Middle East and Islam as inextricably linked in their minds. There's a lot of ways, though, in which the Middle East is not the home of Islam. What might be a reason for that? Okay, question. Where do the majority of Muslims live? They live in Southeast Asia. If you look at the Muslim population around the world, the majority of Muslims do not live in the Middle East. They live in Southeast Asia. So that's one sense in which the public conception of the Middle East and Islam being inextricably linked doesn't necessarily follow with reality. In addition, the Middle East has been an incredibly religiously and ethnically diverse region for its entire history. And so the idea that there are no Jews in Iran, or there are no Christians in Egypt, or that there are no Christians in the whole Middle East is not true, and one that many countries experience a lived reality that is very different from a public perception of the idea that the Middle East is this homogeneously Muslim region. However, because of that public conception, because of the idea that the Middle East and Islam are inextricably linked, there are a lot of, I think, true conceptions and misconceptions about how religion splits down in the Middle East. So a number of very important minorities that I might talk about as debate goes on. There's a couple, but I'll talk through some terminology right now. So, the largest sectarian division in Islam is between two groups that we would call Sunni and Shia. These groups are originally sprung from political ideological disagreement over who would be the both political and religious heir to Muhammad. So after his death, there are two different potential claimants. There's either following the traditional tribal system of electing an eligible leader from the politically from competent males, or there is the new and religiously inspired motivation of having his most eligible or most selected male heir follow on from him, someone who's related to him. Confusingly for most people, this disagreement does not immediately become a problem, as in the tribally elected heir becomes leader of the Muslim community immediately after Muhammad's death, and Ali, his nephew / brother, son-in-law, is elected leader 3 caliphs later. And so it seems that this is not much of a disagreement. However, he's later assassinated, and there's later a small civil war about it, and Sunni and Shias divide over the question of who is the most eligible, who's the most correct to lead the Muslim community. This means that the Shia community has divided several times over who they think is the most eligible, because if you're picking from a line of heirs, sometimes you disagree over who is the best heir. And as happened for the largest Shia sect, the Shia sect called Twelver Shias that are the most popular in Iran, eventually that imam or that leader disappears / dies / is magically suspended between worlds. It's a little unclear what happened to him, but he's not around anymore, and eventually he comes back. Maybe. We don't know. But that's a description of the major sectarian divides. Sunni Islam is a lot less willing to prescribe who is or who should be the most eligible leader. In early history of Sunni Islam, we see a series of caliphs who are political leaders with semi-religious authority, as in they're seen primarily as political secular leaders who have been imbued with some religious authority through their correct behavior and their choice as a caliph. But it's very, very different than, for instance, a Christian idea of who is a religiously elected leader, right? It's very different than an idea of a pope or even of a divinely ordained king. But this means that in the modern era, Sunni Islam is very decentralized. It's not even like what many people try and make equivalents with it. It's not even like Protestant Christianity, which has identified leaders that lead particular communities. A lot of Sunni Islam tells you that you as an individual are imbued with the power to find the correct leader for you. This often does lead to communities following a single leader or following a single religious teaching that they think is the most correct, but it means that it's quite decentralized in terms of what religious authorities there are. It's not like Christianity or even or other faiths where there's an identified church structure, there's an identified structured authority. It's very different than that. That identifies the major sectarian division. So when I talk about where a Sunni majority country is, that means the majority of the Muslims who live in that country would identify themselves as Sunni Muslims. This has some implications for politics in that countries that fall on either side of the sectarian divide can feel very importantly that sectarian divide is important and necessary for understanding their politics. In many ways, I would warn you against saying that Iran is entirely motivated by Shia sectarianism, or that Saudi Arabia is entirely motivated by Sunni sectarianism. But I would also say that it's wrong to say that these countries are entirely motivated by economics or a quest for power and use the idea of sectarianism as a shield. This is a very common international relations argument in which you say there are two different countries on different sides of the sectarian divide. They use that to disguise their own quests for power or their own wish to seek to be their own desire to be a hegemon in the region. I think this doesn't identify the fact that many people in most of these countries do feel the importance of that sectarian divide in their lives and feel that religion is important for them, and those people also do things like get elected or be in charge of things or are religious leaders and are important in these countries. So that's when you understand motivations or when you understand interest in a debate, know that in international relations and know that when you're talking about the motivations of countries, you're talking about lots and lots of different intersecting reasons to pursue policy, and if depending on which side of the debate you are, you're arguing about how you can push those different interests in different directions and how they might intersect with others. Other minorities that are important for understanding the Middle East or important for particular countries. One, in Egypt, Coptic Christians. This is a small sect of Christianity that is very, very old and native to the Middle East, and there's a large number of Coptic Christians in Egypt. In the past, Coptic Christians have been identified with a colonial history in that they often benefited from colonial rule. But this has meant that Coptic Christians have experienced persecution in Egypt, and means that the Coptic Christians have become an important political minority in Egypt. So that when you read about Egypt, don't think of it as an exclusively homogenous Muslim country, because that would I think be misusing or missing out on an opportunity for a good nuance and good understanding of the country in your case. Now, there are a couple very diverse countries in the Middle East, extremely religiously and ethnically diverse. This is particularly in the Levant, so in Israel and Lebanon region, so on the Mediterranean. Lebanon is very diverse. It has stitched together a coalition of different religions and ethnicities by pretending there is some sort of, Lebanese myth of all these people together. There are a number of Lebanese Christians, There are a number of Druze, which are a sort of secretive religious minority that practice a religion that is a combination of Islam and Christianity. There are a lot of different religious minorities in Lebanon, and that means that this country is one that experiences politics religiously and ethnically divided. Okay, so the last minority, and then we're going to start talking a little bit about conflicts, but this is just so we have some terms to start with, is what you are hopefully familiar with, is the Alawites of Syria. See, up until the last mess, the Alawites were a ruling minority in Syria. Alawite religion is similar to the Druze minority in the sense that it's a secret religion. It's a religion you don't share with people outside your religious group, and it's also similar to many other religions, unclear whether it's an ethnic or religious, unclear whether it's exclusively an ethnic or religious divide. That doesn't mean it's not very important for a lot of people who experience it, and it also means that many people feel that small minorities have dominated Syrian politics in the last several decades, and it is one of the contributing reasons as to why there is an ongoing civil war in Syria. Okay, so we're going to go through some maps and talk about a few conflicts. Not this one. This one. Okay, good place to start. We're doing history of the Middle East. I'd go all the way back, like the article, the 50 Maps to Understand the Middle East does, and it literally starts with like the Fertile Crescent and the spread of the Phoenicians. I'm not doing that, because it's not important or relevant, which is the most important things to remember when you're doing international relations in a debate. I'm going to start with more recent history. So this is the Middle East's colonial past. This is the influence of many other countries, especially Western countries, on the Middle East, and the spheres of influence that dominated the Middle East in the late 19th century. Or whichever century it was. I can't remember. Many countries in the Middle East weren't explicitly colonized, but a lot of them feel a colonial past very importantly. For instance, Iran, which is shown on the far east of this map, was never invaded or colonized by foreign powers. Instead, Russia and Britain reached a compromise in which they divided Iran into spheres of influence, in which they sought to extract economic concessions from a democratically elected Iranian government, and then they sought to bully and control the Iranian government as much as possible, and essentially between the two of them fought it out over who was going to have control over Iran without any permission, without taking any permission or say from the Iranian government or the Iranian people. Like a really, really, really rude version of talking about someone as if they weren't there. For many Middle Eastern countries, this history of colonialism, this national memory of the history of colonialism is one that unjustly divided their borders, as with the Sykes-Picot Agreement in the Levant, in Syria and in Lebanon, or one that just sought to extract economic and political concessions from countries across the board and control them, the same way that Western powers attempted to invade part of Egypt in order to control the Suez Canal. This partially explains a lot of national myths in Middle Eastern countries as to why other countries are never going to listen to them. It is all about being able to protect your own country and your own nation, because they're extremely distrustful of the idea that Western countries, or countries that formally attempted to invade them, right, have their best interests at heart. So when Ahmadinejad was president of Iran, there was like a period of time where he was calling America the Great Satan and the Great Devil, and then completely surprised Britain that had decided to forget Iran existed by suddenly pivoting and in speeches and in rhetoric attacking Britain. It's this great Satan, this great evil. And this caused a lot of British news to be like, we forgot Iran was even there. Why do they care? We should invade them. Because these countries do deeply feel and remember a history of colonialism that's important and relevant for their understanding of modern politics and important and relevant for understanding their particular histories. This means that a lot of scandals or revelations or important history that Western countries have forgotten are still remembered and important for understanding politics in these countries today. This is especially relevant when you consider how diverse the Middle East is, both religiously and ethnically. That a lot of the borders that were drawn by Western powers after the end of World War II were drawn in straight lines. John Oliver has a great quote where he's like, any ongoing conflict in the world today, you can travel back 100 years and find like a mustachioed British man being like, I will draw a line through this map and everything will be solved. This is a big problem for a lot of countries in the Middle East that we're going to talk about, or that we are talking about rather. Next map. Right, this is what I was saying. So let's bit zoom in on one region. This is Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which Britain and France divide up parts of the Middle East after World War II, or World War I, after World War I, in which the A and B countries, in which they kind of go, they're not colonies, we're just in charge, nobody look this way. So this is Transjordan, which is the B country, and the French Syria, which is the A country. They also established international control in Israel, which kind of just devolves into we're in charge again, and French direct control of Lebanon, in which the French do it because they're there to protect the Lebanese Christians, but it again devolves into we're in charge. This agreement between these countries drew a bunch of lines through Ottoman kingdoms that had previously been there, or Ottoman principalities, and said, this is where we live, this is where they live, and you're going to have to deal with it. Which did not account for the fact that there are a number of different ethnicities in this region that have a lot of different interests and different cultures and different practices. What might be one important one that's in the news all the time right now in this area? You gave me that right answer like 20 seconds ago. Yeah, the Kurds are in like northern Iraq, the top bit of Syria, and then like a whole bunch of Turkey, right? And they don't have a border drawn around them, you will notice. They have a border drawn through them in multiple different directions. This causes future problems. Spoiler. Okay, moving really fast through the sort of next 80 years of history. I'm going to move right up to 2011, this really small map. This is a map of the Arab Spring, or bits of the Arab Spring. Who wants to give me a 2-sentence definition of the Arab Spring? Clara?
A sort of region-wide attempt at developing fledgling democracies, or at least throwing off the tribal.
Yeah, so where does the Arab Spring start? In Tunisia. It starts in Tunisia. It's triggered in Tunisia by a viral video in which a market worker is burned to death. It's seen as government overreach, and it's finally seen as the straw that breaks the camel's back and people's unwillingness to tolerate the government ignorance or the lack of government, and a lack of their own say in government. The protests in Tunisia go well, as in there's no civil war, there are concessions made by the government, there are fledgling democratic reforms put in place. Theories about this and why Tunisia went particularly well. So there are a number of different competing theories. Theory 1, the West was caught by surprise and not paying attention, and so they didn't have a chance to intervene or bother anyone, and so Tunisia, managed its own business and was helpfully ignored by Westerners who didn't try and meddle. That's theory 1 as to why it went well. Theory 2, Tunisia is smaller, more ethnically and religiously homogenous than a number of other countries in the region, and so feels more comfortable instituting democratic reforms. Feels less like individuals in power are going to lose power or be murdered in the streets. Theory 3, it all happened so fast that nobody was really worried about it spreading to the rest of the world or to the rest of the Middle East because they thought it was a Tunisia-related issue and the Tunisian government could solve it. Now, like Freddie said, these protests, this anger at incompetent governments spreads quickly in the Middle East. Why does it spread? Why does it spread so fast? social media, Twitter especially, but social media as a whole, is captured by activist groups and protesters in order to be able to communicate, to mobilize quickly, and in many ways, those particular communities hadn't been identified, those particular social media platforms hadn't been identified yet by governments as a potential problem. The response by a lot of governments was one we saw in the very, very public protests in Egypt, is to literally turn the internet off, to turn Twitter off, to turn social media off, and to try and shut down communication lines between people. Now, one of the reasons why protests, for instance, in Bahrain recently have been less successful or have garnered less media attention is that governments have been quicker and faster to work to counter social media organizing, to work to counter the capacity for people to organize online. But in the early Arab Spring, there was a lot of optimism and hope about what could be achieved, about the fact that Egypt, which had been a bad place to live for a long time, is making government changes, is something that inspired a significant amount of hope and optimism about what could be achieved in the future. As you can see, these protests and Arab Spring-like uprising spread across the Middle East. Now, after Tunisia, what are our three not-so-good cases in the Arab Spring? Libya, Syria, and Egypt. Libya is functionally not a government right now. There's a number of competing governments on the coast and different disagreements over who should be in charge. 2, Egypt is functionally a military dictatorship that uses the forces of government to oppress its people and to particularly target minorities as scapegoats. 3, Syria is an open civil war, saturated with weapons, and a country that was once middle economically developed, with high internet penetration and a largely and a highly educated population, is now functionally emptying itself as millions of Syrians flee the region and country. Okay, why does this all go so wrong? Start with Libya. What are some theories might you think about why Libya goes wrong? Why is the Libyan government or why are Libyan activists less able to achieve democratic reform than we potentially would have hoped? Ideas?
The Western intervention.
Western intervention? What was the character of Western intervention in Libya? What was it like?
Very violent, like assassination of Gaddafi.
Okay, so interested in removing Gaddafi. 2, not in Libya, above Libya. Just there to bomb Libya, not to land or to put boots on the ground, as it's commonly termed. Why didn't countries intervene on the ground in Libya?
They didn't want another Iraq or Afghanistan or something like that. There's not very much public support for boots on the ground.
So one, the Western tiredness with intervention in the Middle East. The body bag effect. Afghanistan is America's longest war, right? People alive today, young people alive today in America are living in America's longest sustained period of war with another country. So a lack of willingness from Western countries to intervene on the ground meant that intervention was overwhelmingly one characterized by bombing campaigns against those they did not want to run the country. It's hard to correctly target and identify when your campaign is largely interested in bombing. 2, bombing is much more infrastructure damaging than infantry campaigns, than boots on the ground. As in, bombing campaigns are going to reduce the capacity for a country to rebuild after a war. Lastly, what does Libya have? Oil. Libya is oil rich. Most of Libya's oil is in the south part of the country. That's one of the reasons why Gaddafi was able to maintain control for so long, is that he was able to keep control of oil producing when he was in charge, was able to keep control of oil producing regions. A country that is rich has lots of people that would like to be in charge of that country. Dispute on whether you would describe Libya as rich, but it's certainly rich in resources, and somebody who controls Libya could also be rich in those resources. So there's a higher interest in attempting to control the country, and a higher interest in doing it as quickly as possible. Okay, 2. Egypt. Government reacts a lot faster, and Egypt has a long history of military coups. in which Egypt's military is often significantly more trusted by its population than Egypt's politicians. There are a number of reasons for this. One, ongoing incompetence and corruption by Egyptian politicians. Two, a national myth or history of the military being reasonably good at ruling Egypt in the past. There's a lot of nostalgia about a time when Egypt was considered a relevant power, when Nasser pioneered a third way between communism and capitalism. This inspires a national myth in Egypt that the military is who the country turns to in times of strife. This means that when a new democratic government is not seen as doing a good job, and protests continue, it's seen by military officials as part of their role as the military to intervene and take power. This means that instead of the new democracy many Egyptians hoped for, we end up with a new military dictatorship, and a military dictatorship that is worried about future protests, because Egyptian citizens had demonstrated that they were willing to attempt to take control in their government, and they were willing to do it in large numbers and to sustain large losses in order to do so. That's the kinds of violence we saw at Tahrir Square, in which the Egyptian government is now always going to be more concerned in the future by the kinds of changes their population can force on them. This is one of the reasons why the Egyptian military dictatorship identifies particular minorities and pursues them. Coptic Christians, gay men and women, as minorities that they can use as scapegoats to prove to the country that they are doing something to cure Egypt's ills. Okay, next matter. I will talk about Syria, I promise. It's a big topic. Okay, so this is meant to just be illustrative of what I've been trying to emphasize, which is about regional diversity in the Middle East. This is a map of Arabic dialects and shows you the sheer number of different kinds of the same language that are spoken in this region. We obviously think of this region as being incredibly related to one another, but these countries have a lot of different histories. Okay. Next one, when we're talking about Sunni and Shia majority countries, we're talking about how they relate to each other. This is where we're going to talk about our next conflicts. This shows a distribution, crudely, of Shia concentrated areas and Sunni majority areas. So what's the first thing we notice, especially about Iraq?
It's very clear divide between, so that it has both a large proportion of Sunni and Shia.
Okay, excellent. Iraq is different from a lot of other countries in the region in which there is often no clear single majority. This has a lot to do with Saddam Hussein's rule, in which he as a Sunni nationalist leader, convinced Sunnis that they were in the overwhelming majority through a large propaganda campaign and through the idea that they had reclaimed control from a Shia minority. But the country is pretty evenly divided, and numerically between Sunni and Shia individuals, if you exclude those who would identify as Kurdish. And there are particular regions that are overwhelmingly one minority, one sectarian identity and another. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some bigger conflicts that are going on. We're going to start with Syria. Okay, so the Syrian civil war is instigated as part of the Arab Spring, but soon shocks, I think, most foreign observers by devolving into a protracted, bloody, and one of the worst conflicts that this region or most of the world has seen in the last several decades. So there are a number of contributing reasons as to why this is the case. So one, like I said at the beginning, geography is still relevant. Syria was in the middle of an intense drought that had made many individuals who lived in the countryside or had worked in agriculture move to the cities. So all of a sudden, you have a large number of unemployed people who are disgruntled and having to leave their homes, and they live in poverty in the cities. 2011, Arab Spring hits other countries, and you have exactly what you need for revolution, for protest. A large number of people with nothing to do and a lot to be angry about. But this spooks the long-running dictatorship or long-running family business of running Syria, in which the Assad regime I think or the theory is, was taken by surprise by the sheer number and ferocity of protests that happened in Syria, and so attempts to stamp them out. But this results in a long-running conflict between Sunni rebels, between what becomes IS, and between those loyal to the Alawites in Syria. Because a number of these groups are able to control specific areas, they become harder to root out. Because it isn't that they're attempting to rule the whole country. It isn't that many of these Sunni rebel groups are attempting to take control of Syria. They are attempting to defend their area. They are attempting to control other areas. And if they can keep one area that keeps them resourced and they can get funding from other powers, it's hard to eliminate them and means the war lasts for longer. Okay, I realize that I've been talking for much longer than I meant to. But there are a number of demographic reasons across the Middle East that answer the question of why conflict might be so endemic. One, the Middle East is a very young region. Compared to other parts of the world, its population averages younger than other parts of the world. This has a lot to do with a high birth rate, a large number of conflicts, and a high rate of emigration, in which older people are more likely to leave. Two, slow economic development creates what I was talking about, which is the perfect storm for protest, the perfect storm for people who are seeking a greater importance. Young people with nothing to do. They have few economic opportunities. There are few opportunities to increase your standard of living, or to better yourself, or to escape your community. Two, a large number of refugees. So which country do you think took the most refugees from Syria? Clara? Lebanon and Jordan between them. Which country do you think in the world has the most refugees currently living there? Clara? Clara's losing out because I remember her name. Lebanon. A number of refugee camps in Lebanon are essentially 3 generations or more old, as in people live permanently in refugee camps, prevented from working by legislation in Jordan and Lebanon, prevented from integrating, and kept in temporary housing for their entire lives. Without work, without economic opportunity, without the potential to return to their home country, either because it's at war or legally prevents them from doing so, you have, again, a large number of young people with nothing to do and a lot to be angry about. So that is a contributing demographic reason. Then we have large, significant ethnic, religious diversity, which contributes to a large number of young people with nothing to do and a lot to be angry about. Now, then we have sectarian division, we have a history of colonial oppression, we have a recent history of militant groups, and a longer past history of guerrilla warfare and defense of your own country. That means you have the perfect storm for IS. You have the perfect storm for militant rebel groups that seek to defend your own country. The same reason we have Sunni militant rebel groups in Iraq that are willing to defend your own town, that say we can, because the region is largely saturated with weapons after decades-long wars, we can defend ourselves against those who would seek to attack us, we can defend ourselves against those who are different from us. This hasn't worked out for most groups, but what group has defense worked out for? Personal what has community self-defense? Someone hasn't raised their hand yet? Just gonna pick on someone. Who was most successful in the war against IS? Kurdistan. Kurdish rebel groups. Why might this be? One, Kurds have had to spend a long time defending themselves, as in there are a number of very organized rebel slash terrorist groups, depending on which side of the Turkish border you're on, who have a long history of operating and protecting Kurdish people. It means they're mobilized, it means they're organized, and it means they can crucially do it without lots of funding from other countries. They're willing to work on a shoestring budget to defend Kurdistan. So it's one of the reasons why they were very successful against IS, because the Iraqi government could barely pay its own soldiers, whereas whereas the Kurdish defense organizations were willing to work without pay or as a volunteer force. It's a different dynamic. I think I have another map. Aha! This is a good one. We're going to move east. And then I'm going to finish up. We're going to answer questions, and then we're going to do a debate. So, this is a map of ethnic groups of the Middle East. It's a crude outlaying of what is a great deal of diversity. But we're going to move east from conflict in Syria. What strikes you about Afghanistan? Colorful? What does colorful mean in the context of this map?
Ethnically diverse. Very ethnically diverse.
Very ethnically diverse. And, crucially, drew a big line through one of the country's largest majority tribal groups and put some of them in Pakistan and some of them in Afghanistan, which coincidentally makes the border quite porous when your family live on one side and you live on the other side. And some guy draws big lines in the dirt and says, don't go over this, that's another country. You don't listen very much to that, to be honest. So, the Taliban in Afghanistan are rather different than some of the other groups we've encountered, in that the Taliban combine religious fundamentalism with tribal traditionalism. So some of their practices, some of their ideology is drawn from a particularly fundamentalist approach to Islam, but a lot of it is drawn from a particularly fundamentalist approach to tribal tradition, and the idea that a secular Afghani government is going to take apart that tribal tradition and the traditions that they want to keep in their community. These traditions include a lot of things, but the most famous one that most people will be familiar with is oppression of women and a lack of women's education. But this has a lot to do with a very diverse country in which different tribal and ethnic groups want to protect their own interests in the government. If you feel that one tribal or ethnic group controls the region, or controls the country, or politics or the government much more than you do, or for instance the army has significantly more from one religious or ethnic group than you do, the best way to do that is the best way to prevent that is to, one, seek to control the government, which the Taliban successfully did. Two, seek to control your particular region, which a number of Sunni militant groups do very successfully in Iraq. Two, seek to protect your own people at the expense of all others, as small Sunni militant groups do in Syria. Attempt to establish a global caliphate, which ISIS unsuccessfully manages to do in a very small portion of Syria. 5, run a secular government, that you are in charge of forever. That's the Alawite approach to how to stay in charge of things forever, or how to have your religious and ethnic minority dominant. Okay, that was like speed run through the Middle East. Questions? Please ask some questions. You guys have been really quiet so far, but I want to answer questions, and if I don't know the answer, I will tell you I don't know, and then I will give you a link to an article that will answer it. Yes?
Where would you say the buffer zones of what Syristan is on the Afghan border? And is that significant at all? You talked about that brown area is probably where like the large tribal group was divided.
I'll see if I can find a map with Pakistan in it. I have one. I have an old one. My old folder. Scroll. Right.
I mean, if you Google federally administered tribal areas,
Yeah, so
probably
I've got
into
the map.
Afghanistan.
Right. So this is zoom in on Afghanistan. So the brown section, Pashtun. This is Pakistan right here, right? More brown here, basically. So the border kind of runs through where most people would consider themselves Pashtun, which means that the border becomes quite porous. And it also means that in times of conflict or in times where the government is not functioning, a lot of these regions will functionally self-govern, as in no one says they are, and no one gives them any money, but they're run their own regions when the government does not work, which happens on and off.
Is that the same group who quote unquote run like North, East, South, Waziristan?
Any other questions?
Could you give a really brief explanation of the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Yemen?
Yes, that was a new one that I didn't remember to include. So, Yemen is a divided country, previously ruled by a Sunni dictatorship, and there are a number of what you will have read about in the news is called Houthi rebels. The Houthi are a Shia sect that follow the seventh Imam. And they are rebelling against this dictatorship and attempting to take control of Yemen. They have managed to establish control over part of Yemen, and Saudi Arabia, as a Sunni majority country, and as a country incredibly interested in maintaining economic and political control over its own region, also concerned with defending its own border with Yemen, number of different intersecting interests, like I laid out at the beginning. Did not want this to happen. Did not want these rebel groups to take control of Yemen. So it is leading a war against these Houthi rebels, largely a bombing campaign, but funded by Western powers, in which they attempt to destroy the control of Houthi rebels. This is partially about Saudi Arabia. So again, Middle East is confusing and complicated, and everyone tells you that they know what they're doing. They're probably lying, and point out that they're lying in the debate, and the judge can't believe their lies. How the rules work. This is partially about Saudi Arabia's opposition to Iranian control in the region, in which Iran is implied to be contributing to the Houthi rebel cause. It is unclear the extent to which Iran is doing that. Iran has definitely said they are in favor of the Houthi rebels, but it's unclear as to whether or not they are supporting them with material, as to whether or not they are funding them significantly. Saudi Arabia is very, very clearly trying to help the actual Yemeni government. So it's partially about opposing expanded Iranian control of the Middle East. Two, it's partially about internal Saudi politics, which the current crown prince wants to establish that he is the best heir. He wants to be able to eliminate a number of rivals. He wants to have his cause, and wants to be seen as someone who can counter Iranian aggression or Iranian expansion. And so the war in Yemen is the crown prince's cause d'islam in Saudi Arabia. He was previously the defense minister of the Saudi government, so he was the one who pursued this war. It's partially about being able to protect the Saudi border, in which Yemen is on the border of Saudi Arabia, so they have vested interest in that. And it's partially about them seeming to be tough on terror, so they can keep American investment and American interest in Saudi Arabia. And so they want to portray Houthi rebels as a uncontrollable terror group who are not interested in joining the country. It's unclear whether or not the Houthi rebels are an uncontrollable terror group or are attempting to free their country from oppression, or kind of both, which is what usually happens. The war is devastating. Hundreds of thousands of people in Yemen are suffering from the lack of infrastructure. It was already a desperately poor country, and there's been significant outbreaks of cholera. So this intersection of different Saudi interests and the fact that Western countries are pretty in favor of Saudi Arabia doing its own intervening so they don't have to, and not interested in getting involved, has resulted in a massive humanitarian crisis on the end of the peninsula. That's my speed run through. Yes?
I have two follow-up questions.
Sure.
One is, I know that Saudi Arabia is in a coalition to fight in Yemen. I was wondering what the dynamics within the coalition are. And secondly is, I know that there are a lot of economic migrants from Yemen that are working in Saudi Arabia, particularly in the oil industry, that is largely reliant on migrant workers rather than actual Saudi citizens. So do you think that affects the internal politics of Saudi Arabia? Because I can't find any reporting on how the migrant situation situation in Saudi Arabia affects their war.
There's some really interesting economic papers about it. I can try and find you some, because there's been some interesting research, largely not to do with Yemeni workers, a lot to do with South Asian, Southeast Asian workers in Saudi Arabia, and how that affects demographics and politics. To answer your first question, Saudi Arabia is involved in a coalition, and it's with a number of powers that are not as powerful as Saudi Arabia, and are a number of its allies. This includes the Emirates, and other small states in the Persian Gulf. This means that Saudi Arabia is the major player in this coalition, and a lot of these smaller countries are wise to the fact that the most powerful and biggest and richest country that is right next door to them is not the guy to piss off, unless you are Qatar, in which case you are not wise to that. You are like the punk kid in the back of the class who's under blockade. To stretch the metaphor. So yes, that is a coalition. Dynamic is largely one of Saudi control, but one in which countries want to demonstrate that they are, part of the willing to migrant workers in Saudi Arabia and Gulf states. A lot of Gulf states, and especially Saudi Arabia, but a lot of this applies to a few of them, are very, very oil rich. They use oil revenue to pay citizens. So some of the Emirate countries, for instance, in the Emirates, you don't get taxed as a citizen, you get paid by the government to be a citizen. So like, sweet deal. But only if you're like the very small number of people who are actually citizens there. It turns out when your country is like 80, 90% desert, not a lot of people live there. These countries ship in a large number of migrant workers from countries all around the world. There are a large number of Southeast Asian workers and South Asian workers in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. If any of you did any reading about the World Cup in Qatar, is that where football is? You will have done some reading about potential slave workers in these regions. A lot of them come over and receive their pay when they leave, as opposed to are paid while they're there. They have very few rights as workers in their country, can't vote, often are completely unable to become citizens, have very, very few rights, I said that, but even fewer than the first time. I will.
Which is a passing addenda to that. There's also a strange custom that says your boss gets to keep your passport until he decides to give you a passport.
As I don't know if you have to call it a custom, or it's designed to keep you wherever you are. Domestic workers are often migrant workers. A lot of domestic workers in Saudi Arabia come from the Philippines and work for Saudi families and have their passports confiscated and are only able to go home with the permission of the family that they work for. But this means that the dynamic is one of a country that extremely economically relies on workers that are not citizens, can't vote, are taken extreme advantage of. And so if it becomes more attractive to work elsewhere, or as many of the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia are beginning to realize that it is difficult to move your country forward in terms of economic development when you have very few workers in your own country, this becomes a difficult political and economic dynamic. This is one of the internal reform programs of the new Crown Prince, in Saudi Arabia especially, Saudi Arabia only, because he's the only Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, in which he's attempting to make Saudis work in jobs, which a very small percentage of Saudi Arabians work. And part of his reforms around the rights and rights of women, or the capacity for women to be able to transport themselves and drive, etc. It's really hard to get women employed, and they can't go anywhere or do anything. So by letting them do things and go places, they can get employed and buy stuff, which is the hope for a lot of these countries, that they can transition away from an over-reliance on cheap workers from abroad, especially since their desire to be accepted into a wider community means they need to stop using slave workers. Does that answer the question?
What's the extent of the diplomatic crisis that Qatar is facing now, and what are you think the long-term impacts of this?
So Qatar is really interesting. It's kind of fallen out of the news largely because some negotiated agreements lessened the negative impacts that Qatar is experiencing because of Saudi Arabia's determination to sanction them and blockade them. Qatar has been a small thorn in Saudi Arabia's side for the last several years. So who here knows Al Jazeera? People like moving a little? Cool. Okay, Al Jazeera is, or at least originally was, extensively funded by the Qatari government as a sort of Qatar advertising project. Like, look at Qatar, we've got this great news service, we're like really developed and have all this democracy. And Al Jazeera really revolutionized communication in the Middle East when it first became a cable news channel back in the day before Twitter. Because it was sort of the first time there was like good constant news reporting and investigation of countries in the Middle East ever by Middle Eastern reporters. But Al Jazeera is kind of one of the major complaints against the Qatari government, that despite the constant denials by the Qatari government or by Al Jazeera's like running bodies or by its journalists that they are neutral and that they are not run by the Qatari government and that they are not used as a Qatari propaganda attack dog, nobody has believed them, especially not Saudi Arabia. And the fact that Al Jazeera has reported on and investigated corruption and misgovernment and bad things that Saudi Arabia has done means that Saudi Arabia thinks that the Qatari government is like sicking Al Jazeera on them in order to like embarrass them on the global stage. So in terms of the consequences for Qatar, which was your question, the Al Jazeera's like side thing. It's not the only reason they don't like Qatar. Big reason though. Good reason to know in a debate. So the consequences for Qatar. One seems to have been the kind of confused but not good for Qatar reaction of the American government. In that America's big player, especially in the peninsula, where it invests a significant amount of money. Qatar had an American base there, and having American support is really important for being able to protect your country, make sure Saudi Arabia doesn't invade. Trump seemed to be on the Saudi side, and his Secretary of State seemed to be on the Qatari side, which kind of confused the negotiations significantly, and kind of demonstrated that it's not possible for a lot of countries in the region to rely on rational or developed or competent American responses to problems in that region. So I think it spooked a number of countries that they couldn't accurately predict American responses anymore, whereas it wasn't necessarily that American responses were rational previously, but they were at least easier to predict as to how to respond. Two is going to be a long-term economic impact on Qatar, in which it's a tiny country in the Persian Gulf that relies on being able to communicate and access other countries and not be blockaded and flies in a lot of its food. So that small period of sanction is going to have, and any continuing sanctions could have economic impacts on Qatar. Final long-term impact, I think, is pushing Qatar closer to Iran, right? A lot of the reason why Qatar survived or didn't crumble under the blockade is that Iran started flying in resources for the country. So that means Saudi Arabia has lost a potential neutral party and pushed them closer to Iran in the sort of long chess game between these countries, where one country's playing chess, the other country's playing another complicated game, they're kind of playing it next to each other. Any other questions? These are all really good questions. Good job, guys. Yes.
I have a question just on economic development in the region, which has been populated by wealthy but stagnant, and now it looks like Saudi Arabia at least is liberalizing and they're attempting to diversify. Is that an overall trend for the region? What would be a brief characterization of some significant countries and what it looks like and where it's working out stuff?
Okay, that's good. That is a good question. So, an economic characterization of the region would be what would be politely termed schizophrenic. The peninsula, so Persian Gulf states, these are oil-rich countries, large numbers of resources, an ethnically homogeneous population that's quite small, and a large number of government revenue. In the past, this means extremely wealthy, but relatively stagnant and very dependent on oil prices. These countries are very active in OPEC and so partially able to control oil prices, so oil prices often reflect their economic needs. But they've been spooked in the last several years by falling oil prices that they instigated as a result of increased oil production in the Western Hemisphere. Shale oil in Western Hemisphere makes countries that they want to be reliant on them, like the USA, less reliant on them. So Saudi Arabia and other OPEC countries push the oil price low to drive expensive shale oil out of business, right? It's really hard to dig in the sand to find oil. It's a really bad explanation of what shale oil is. And it costs a lot of money, whereas it does not cost a lot of money to remove liquid oil from the peninsula. So pushing the oil price low is an indicating factor that these countries are concerned about the long-term future of their domination in the oil market. This is one of the reasons why we see potential economic liberalization or an interest in special economic zones in some of the countries in the peninsula that we would describe as oil states or Gulf states. Economic development elsewhere. Prior to the revolution, Iran was a highly industrialized country that would have been considered middle income. It's still the case, but Iranian citizens are largely concerned with economic mismanagement of the government in the last sort of 8 years. Ahmadinejad, for all his qualities, was not an economic genius, and so the Iranian economy has been one that many citizens feel has not benefited them or has slowed in the last year. So the Iranian government has been attempting to focus on economic development in Iran. Let's scroll up, there's not a map of Afghanistan. And the middle of the Middle East, the Levant region, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, have suffered from long periods of war and huge flows of refugees that have made it difficult to develop economically. Iraq was also what we would have called at the time relatively middle income, controlled by a dictator who was able to essentially control the economy and focus on industrialization and Arab nationalism, which was obsessed with industrialization. But long periods of war have devastated the infrastructure of these countries and the capacity for them to produce economically or to provide for their citizens. Turkey, additionally, is a country that relies significantly on the oil production of the countries of countries like Iraq, and so has suffered economically as a result of the large war and large flows of refugees. So that's kind of speed through. Like I said earlier, poverty and a lack of economic development in the Middle East is a large contributing reason for long-term conflicts, and it becomes a chicken and egg problem in which you don't know whether the conflict created the poverty or whether the poverty created the conflict. I scrolled up because this is very zoomed in version, but when I said that Lebanon was very diverse, I meant it. This is a map of Lebanon. Okay, does anyone have any other questions? I've been going for a long time.
How much time?
Sorry?
How much time is there before I ask?
So as you recall, there's always the risk of us getting chucked out of the rooms at 9. So it depends on whether people definitely want to do a practice debate or they want to extend the Q&A session. In which case, there won't end up being a practice debate, probably because we'll get chucked out of the building. I'm happy to do whatever the majority want.
I can answer your question quickly, if you want.
No, it's fine. It's fine. We should just move on.
So there won't be a practice debate?
Do people want to do a practice debate?
Or would people rather do a longer Q&A?
Practice debate.
Okay, 2 people said practice debate semi-loudly, so we're going with the practice debate. Democracy in action!
So
Thanks, guys. Good audience. Well done.